Sometimes the drummer has already figured it out and there isn't really anything that needs to be added. In other cases,
they get fired.
I don't think anyone would get removed for something like that. That happens more when they can't actually perform the parts.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Hey everybody, it's Lid Shaw, your host of Recording Studio Rockstars, the podcast bringing you inside the recording studio. I created this show to introduce you to real-world recording professionals to hear their stories and learn from their experiences so that you can take your records to the next level and become a rock star of the recording studio yourself. My guest today is the extraordinary producer, programmer, performer, songwriter, arranger, mixer, engineer, and author, Michael Beinhorn.
Hello.
Hey, Michael.
How you doing?
So Michael began his career as a keyboard player with Bill Laswell in the band Material and had a major breakthrough in the 80s as co-writer of the seminal hip-hop classic Rockit with Herbie Hancock, song that I grew up with. He went on to produce an impressive discography that includes Soundgarden Superunknown, the Red Hot Chili Peppers' Uplift, Mofo, Party Plan, and Mother's Milk, Soul Asylum, Grave Dancers Union, and Korn Untouchables, among many others. Michael developed a reputation for producing artists' career records and was ultimately nominated for a Grammy in 1998 as Producer of the Year for his work with Celebrity Skin by Hole and Mechanical Animals by Marilyn Manson, both amazing records. And if that wasn't enough, Michael, I'm still going here. Michael has also gone on to create new technology as well. Looking for the best way to capture a broad frequency range during the recording process, he commissioned John French of JRF Magnetics to develop the ultra-analog recording format in 1994. This format featured the first 2-inch 8-track tape machine with unequaled bass and transient response. Basically, think of the fattest drum sound you can possibly put onto analog tape, and you've got it. And finally, Michael is a prolific author, sharing his experience in music and insights with the rest of us. He has an ongoing blog called How to Save Popular Music, where he comments on the state of music today. And in 2015, Michael wrote a book called Unlocking Creativity, fantastic book which outlines his personal experience with the creative process as a record producer. Of course, I'm going to include all of the links to these things in the show notes afterwards. I'm so very excited and nervous to have Michael Beinhorn with us on Recording Studio Rockstar that I almost called in sick and pretended to miss the school bus this morning. Thanks for joining us, and I can't believe I'm about to say this to you, Michael, but are you ready to rock?
I most certainly am.
That's so cool, man. Thanks for bearing through my long-winded introduction for you there, too.
Oh, thank you.
So, Michael, I've given our listeners some idea of who you are, but can you tell us a little bit in your own words of where you come from and how you began in this making music?
Yeah, I was basically pretty much like anyone else who really loves music growing up. I mean, I grew up in a household where my parents played a lot of classical music and a lot of Beatles. Just listening to all that had a really profound effect on me from the get-go. It kind of took over my life pretty much. I think it interfered with my ability to do anything scholastically. So eventually I dropped out of high school and went my own way. We formed Material, Bill Laswell, Fred Moore, and myself. We went on to do our own records and we started producing other people. I never really had an inkling to be a producer. I just kind of fell into the occupation more or less. And everything just kind of grew out from there pretty much. It was a really interesting natural progression of events.
Was this Northeast? Was this New York City, or was this West Coast?
Yeah, this was all Northeast. And it was, I think the West Coast was similarly fertile, but the Northeast had something else going on in it at that time. This is like the late 70s. And you see a lot of people mythologizing, talking about the mythology. I feel like I'm a FUD right now.
Something I noticed reading your book, that you're a man of fantastic words. So I love that you've already dropped scholastic and mythologizing on us.
Yeah.
So continue, please.
Yeah, I know. I'm able to operate past the fact that I'd never made it out of high school.
Music is often about compensation, so that's great.
Yeah, in some cases overcompensation, but that's another story. Yeah, it just kind of worked out from there. But what I was saying about New York in the 70s was it was just, I don't know, it was like this perfect confluence of everything. It was the most fertile breeding ground for people who wanted to be creative, didn't want to have a job to make money, and basically tried to live by their wits and their creativity. Every time you were in Manhattan, you just felt this sense of like this incredible sort of like pulse and this vibrancy that was taking place. And at the same time, there was this extraordinary sense of danger. Like literally, if you went to certain parts of the city at that point in time, you didn't know if you were going to be alive the next day.
Yeah, really.
It was crazy. But like you saw people in punk rock bands like mine who really couldn't, who weren't really adept. Some of us, I mean, I can't speak for Bill because he's a terrific musician, but like for myself, I never considered myself much of a technician. And, we'd be jamming with other players or like luminaries in like the jazz field and stuff like that. And it was just an amazing time to be getting rolling. And it really informed everything that I did from that point forward.
So you were playing alongside the likes of Herbie Hancock, but I'm guessing you were also at places like CBGB's at that time?
Well, this was before Herbie. Like we didn't start working with Herbie until 83. We played shows at CBGB's, the Mud Club, Hurrahs, Tier 3, like all these sort of legendary performance spaces in the, the downtown New York scene at that time. And, we're talking from like 1979 on, until we started getting asked to go to like jazz festivals in Europe, which I always thought was really funny for a person like me who was, more from synth world, not as much of a player as some of the other people that I work with.
That's wild. Well, so Michael, I like to ask my guests to share an inspirational quote to start out. And I don't know if you have one, but I've got so many printed out from you and from your book already. I thought I might suggest one unless you've got one you'd like to start with yourself.
Well,
or both. We can take turns.
Okay. Well, I've actually got two.
All right, you go first.
It's not overkill.
No. You know what? If this podcast goes on and on and on and on, and people's phones run out of batteries, I still think it'll be legit.
Okay. Well, here's one. If you withhold your brilliance from the world, you will suffer for it later.
Nice. I like that. Well, let's share some more brilliance. I love it.
And one more.
Okay.
Talent is often nothing other than being far more dedicated, focused, patient, and intent-driven than anyone else who does the same job as you.
Right. So it's almost that advice to just do it, right? Put in the work, put in the time, and get started. It's
just do it, but the twist is with intent. That's the difference. And that's something that, the whole just do it thing is like, it's all well and good. But I find that now it's a lot easier to understand the what than to understand the why. And if you don't have a firm grasp on what why is in this case, you wind up missing a lot. And you wind up losing a lot too,
I love that. So now what about, I think people often find themselves knowing the what, like you say, and starting, and maybe they start doing the work. Can you find your why along the way?
Oh, yeah. I mean, in my case, I sort of always knew what why was.
Okay.
And in my case, I think why was because there's nothing else.
Right.
Because there's literally nothing else. And because this is the thing that kind of moves me, that kind of makes me get up in the morning, that makes me, that's not to discount relationships with people in life, which are also very, very important. But at the same time, I find for myself, if I'm not connected with that, it's so easy for me to lose my way. And then the what becomes something completely different, because you begin to create different contexts for these things. And that's when, for example, something that was creative and fun for you becomes a job, and then it becomes drudgery, and then it becomes a utility where it's kind of where you begin repeating yourself, and all of a sudden you forgot why you started doing it in the first place.
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a perfect segue to my next question, which is for you to share with us an example on your own journey where you experienced that, an important failure in your life or a time when you felt like you lost your why.
Oh man, there have been so many of those. I can tell you about one, and I think I even may have written a little bit about it. I did kind of take a cushy job at a record company at one point. Initially my reasoning is that I felt like I could do a lot of good, that I could actually motivate people at the record company to want to be interested in artist development. This is like the late 90s. So at that point in time, it was pretty apparent to me that people were not taking that aspect of the process seriously at all.
Yeah.
And, somewhere along the way inside of the company, I just sort of became corrupted over to their ethics, I suppose, or lack thereof. And I started to envision myself as someone much different than who I came into this as. It changed my thinking for a little while. And it took me a long time to get back to a place where I was like, wait a sec. This is not me. This does not feel right. And, it was a profound lesson in what, at least in my case, not to do.
Well, what you just described, that ability to sort of find your compass bearings again. Reading your book, you talk about producing a record and talking about being there almost as a mentor to help an artist along in that process. And it almost sounds like the artist is lucky because having you there, they have an opportunity to have that redirection of the compass bearing and finding their why condensed into what might be a month or two. And, your description of the process on your own sounds like it might have even taken years to get back to that.
Oh man, it's tough. It's really tough, especially if you're kind of like in old dog mode at that time.
Right.
It makes it a lot harder to rediscover your bearings, let alone to discover the necessity or to feel the necessity because something's not quite right. But the thing is that the sensation of something being not quite right is often like great way to, that in itself is a great way to inform you that something needs to change.
I'm going to share with you a quote now that I thought was really funny from your book, and it sort of describes maybe what you just described as the sensation you had when you were there at the top and feeling like you were losing touch with your why. So the quote goes like this: "The old school record producer stereotype was an omniscient evil genius, a pale-skinned puppet master Svengali who intimidated and manipulated his bewitched charges while rolling with the jet set in the evenings and on weekends." So tell us about some really, some great, funny yacht stories during that time.
Well, I got to be honest with you. I saw a lot of silly stuff happen in the recording studio, but I never wound up on anyone's private seafaring vessels or anything like that. I think I was so sort of driven to do the work.
Yeah. That
it wasn't anything for some, when there were parties or things like that, I'd be like, no. I think later on in life at certain points, especially when I was working with bands that were more kind of party, I guess, obsessed, there may have been a little bit of that.
Well, you get out of the studio sometimes, but I know what you mean. When you're really driven to be making a record, sometimes that's all you want to do.
Yeah.
So it's cool to hear you say that. I know my initial experience or introduction to you was around the time of, it was Rockit, and I didn't know it until recently. So I applaud you on co-writing that amazing song. That certainly was one that I grew up with. But then again, later was at the time of Mechanical Animals and Celebrity Skin. Those were both records those were our bearings at times when I was making records in the studio in the late 90s. And so we used to talk about you, we used to say Michael Beinhorn this and Michael Beinhorn that. And I heard this and I heard that. So I thought I would jump in and share back with you a couple of funny, rumor mill things that you let you respond to them. One of them I saw on your blog, which was hearing the rumor that you were somebody who was likely to potentially fire a drummer from a record on the way.
Yeah.
And you had a great response to that. I printed it out. I don't know if I still have it in front of me. But But, it also came when I was reading an article with the drummer, and I apologize for not remembering his name, from Marilyn Manson. But he talked all about that, and he talked about how proud he was that he made the cut when he started that record with you.
There wasn't a snowball's chance in hell, that's Ginger. There wasn't a snowball's chance in hell that he would have gotten bounced, because he was a player. I mean, he came in, he knew the parts, he was dedicated. The only people who don't wind up playing on records that they do, at least in my experience, are people who either can't for one reason or another. And I've actually seen people very gracefully step aside and go, I just can't hack this, and I know it. Which is, I have to say, that is a mark of someone who is a true adult. Like, I've seen people do that, and I've just been impressed by their characters. Or people who have some kind of issue, generally it's a personal issue that's keeping them from being able to do the job. But the thing is that when your directive making a record is to make the very best record that you want to make, and that's your job, and what you've been hired to do by the people you're producing, you can't. You can choose to sort of take someone else's feelings into account and cause that to affect your judgment if you choose. I just never chose that.
Yeah, well, I think that what you're describing is personally investing yourself in making the record and knowing that everybody's counting on you to not only make a quick call on what a right decision is, but also make a quick call on what a wrong decision is. And I have not ever had the experience of having to determine, I'm trying to think, maybe I have, determining if somebody's playing on a record or not. But I've certainly made some decisions like that in the moment where it's like, I have to decide, okay, this isn't cutting it. Let's have somebody else try the tambourine part, for example. But hold on, I found my quote. I found your quote, rather, so I'm going to share it back because it's just so funny.
Okay.
You said, stating that a record producer has fired a drummer is like stating that a mechanic is changing a tire on a car or a butcher has sliced a piece of fat off an otherwise lean piece of meat. It's just part of the process. I mean, it's like, deciding that a guitar is out of tune. I mean, it sounds, out of context, it sounds sort of like the evil Svengali description, but it's only because we're talking about, an individual as opposed to an instrument. But anyway, so I thank you for responding to that. I didn't want
there was also one other thing about that. That was also at a time when it was kind of par for the course in a lot of cases, and certainly more, as much, if not more so, in the 1980s, to just take drummers off sessions without even thinking about it. There were producers who actually had their own team who would come in and play the record, and it didn't matter who the band were. It would just be like, you're replaced, you're replaced, you're replaced.
Yeah.
So that was fairly normal practice. I always thought it was kind of odd that this one particular event should be so... But, it shows you what a whole bunch of hype can do.
Yeah, isn't that what the rumor mill is all about?
Yeah.
Well, replacing people certainly never happened in the world of Motown or, with the Monkees, for example.
No, never.
All right, so then let me think. Another one that I heard was on, how do I bring this up? I certainly don't want to get too specific, but there was a record you did where you had vocals that were going to be, we were in the era of tuning vocals. So this is late 90s. So that was common practice in a pop record or a big record. And I think I heard the story that you had sent the vocals back 5 times for them to get the tuning of the vocals right, which I loved. Because meanwhile, I was sitting in a studio somewhere spending 8 hours a day tuning one lead vocal by hand because the artist didn't like the sound of auto-tune.
Well, I think that there are a lot more occurrences of that than even this particular project. There were many reasons too. One of which is that the tuning algorithms that people had back then really flattened the tonality and of the vocal. And when you've spent so much time trying to get a vocal to cut through a track and to sound good in the midst of specific instrumentation, that's, when I say specific, it's specific to the recording that you're working on. It's really disheartening to have someone tune a vocal and realize that you've lost probably more than you've gained by having the vocal tuned, and your brain starts going like, all right, how do you compensate for this? And
sure.
I think in that stage, I don't know if it was 5 actually, but I do know. No, I do know that the first thing that happened was that the vocals came back perfectly in tune. And for this particular vocalist, that was absurd.
Well, that was like 10 years too soon, right?
Oh, yeah.
That worked later. 15 years later, that was perfect.
Yeah, but it wouldn't work on a rock record, and it wouldn't sound like that vocalist. To me, if you're going to tune a vocal, which is in some cases inevitable, it's probably better to have it appear transparent than to have the listener be aware that some hanky-panky is going on.
Right.
So it was important at that point for the vocals to sound at least natural if they're going to be closer to pitch.
Yeah. Well, I suppose you probably, since you've worked with so many different artists, sometimes you work with an artist where overly tuned vocals is exactly the right thing to do because it's taking the tool or the method so far that it becomes a new artistic statement.
I haven't worked on any projects where that was appropriate. I wouldn't say that it's wrong. I would just say that it's something that is a matter of, when it's right, then you do it.
Yeah. Well, again, without necessarily getting into it, I will say that the particular record that I'm referring to, the vocals turned out perfectly. So well done.
Thank you. And the funny thing about it is if we're talking about the same record, about 70% of those vocals came from a day and a half worth of singing.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yep.
So let's talk about vocals a little bit more. So when you are cutting vocals on a record, in an example like that perhaps, does it take a lot of work and then all of a sudden you get to a day and a half where everything's just so dialed in and you're right on point? Or was this a situation maybe where you just had a day and a half and you just had to do it?
This all depends on the artist. In almost every case, it pertains to the psychology of the artist. Their behavioral pattern, what they do. Like in the example of the artist you're talking about, this was something where I didn't know this about them, but everything after their first takes were generally technically better, but they didn't have the right kind of emotional flow. What happened is that we spent a very, very long time recording vocals, and I kept sitting there going like, something isn't right. It's crazy. And then I went back to these to these tracking vocals, and everything I wanted was right there. Unfortunately, they were all over the place, and I was like, but this has the right kind of emotional statement that I'm looking for. It kind of cracks the song wide open. That was the result of, as I said, a day and a half. With other people, sometimes you have to go deeper. I've done other records where it was a lot of work, took days, sometimes weeks. And then other records where it was a question of finding the right atmosphere to record a vocalist in, to kind of make them comfortable with their surroundings so that they were able to get the best performances. But in the end, it's all about the performance.
I'll point something out as an observation that I've seen too, for people who are listening and struggling with trying to figure out how to get the best vocal. A lot of times you think you have some control over the vocal when you're in the control room. You're turning knobs, you're setting compressors, you're trying to get the right sound. And what you discover eventually is that you can have the exact same setup and the exact same singer can come in the morning and sing it one way and come back after lunch and sing it a completely different way. And it turns out that, like you pointed out, Michael, you're really just trying to find the right moment for the artist to perform it just the right way. Yeah.
I mean, and everyone's different. Some people respond well to direction, and some people have not only don't respond to it, they put a wall up instantly. And a lot of times it's harder to break that wall down once it's been erected than to just bypass the idea of directing a person and keep them in a work state, or try and work with them to find the right state for them to work in.
Well, you talk a lot about that in your book. I mean, you really, in a lot of ways, sound like being a producer is being a psychologist, because you're really talking about getting inside the emotional process of a record and helping an artist find their way, with the like you said, the why of the record and the why of the songs that they're recording. I'm looking for a quote here that might take us right back to that. But here's one right here. You said that your advice is to establish sensory reference points for or with the artist that they can begin to identify, refer to, and use as emotional benchmarks. These benchmarks are points of interest in an artist's work. They can be a feeling in the body or a strong memory that is used as an anchor to recall an emotional state. This can help bring an artist into a deeper relationship with their work. Can you comment a little bit about that and what, you just have such a perspective and you're sharing such deep knowledge about the production process. I mean, I haven't read you talk about a microphone setting once in this book yet,
Yeah. Well, a lot of people have done it far better than I could. So, what I'm referring to is the fact that we need visceral anchors, things that are felt. You can talk about concepts, you can refer to things in the most abstract ways, but you can't really relate them to other people. Not really. Your concept is still going to be your concept, and you're going to experience it the way you experience it if it remains in the abstract. However, if you look at these things and you try and focus on looking for visceral stuff, I mean, keep in mind, and this is very, very important, this is something that I say quite frequently, but music is the most profoundly efficient delivery system of emotion.
Wow.
That's really what it comes down to. That's what you're delivering. All this stuff about, you need a great song, great performance, it's actually superfluous to the real thing that's being delivered. You're still talking about technical stuff.
And I would add to that, I would point out that part of the definition of what you're saying is you're talking about one human being delivering that emotion to another human being. There's got to be person-to-person communication.
Well, in communication, I think it would be assumed that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That's the idea. You're basically trying, through whatever means are available at your disposal, to communicate an emotional state, but you're not doing it by explaining an idea. You're not trying to, present them with an abstract verbal expression of a concept. You're sharing an emotional state with someone. In my situation, my job is to find the best and most efficient way to be able to help the people I'm working with express themselves in the purest and most perfect way, the distillate of what it is that they do, so that whatever it is that they're trying to say, or even if it comes down to who they actually are as people, and that's the message that's coming through their music, that it comes through loud and clear.
And so do you sometimes have artists that show up and they're using words to describe the emotion they're trying to communicate? Like maybe somebody's wanting to make an angry record or a frustrated record or something that's on the edge of breakdown, yet you're not finding that they're truly expressing themselves? Yeah, happens all the time. And it's great for me. I'll often, and I think I outline this in the book, ask people to give me descriptions, to use to use words to be able to describe what it is that they're trying to do, what they're trying to say in a song that they've written, what that song means to them. And, it's my job then to decipher, to kind of crack the code of their language and their communication device in order to have that come across in the recording that we're making together as a collaboration. And how often do you find that the environment of the studio or just the way that the band is mic'd up is something that limits your ability to do that? Is that something that you sometimes have to just completely rethink the way you're recording this? Or do you find that there are often ways to redirect and express the emotion, but not get caught up in the technology?
To me, the technology is supposed to exist as something to grease the wheels of progress, so to speak. So if you have it, you're able to get the idea across that much better. To me, in this particular way of thinking, every single aspect of the process matters. The recording technology, the microphones you're using, the mindset that you come into the project with, the mindset you come into the studio with every day, the performers, the instruments they're playing, where in the room you put a guitar amplifier. Everything matters. It's all relevant. And you want to get it all right. The extent to which you don't have optimal circumstances with which to work with is the extent to which you have to make compromises here and there, but you kind of have to they have to be conscious and intentful compromises at that point, and just try and find ways to pick up the slack where you feel you might have lost something.
Well, we probably have a lot of listeners who have home studios, and they may just have one or two mics and something simple with a DAW to record in. So they may not have the option of switching their microphones. But do you have any thoughts for how people can start thinking outside the box if they're recording at home?
Well, the first thing that I think is really important is to just have a profound knowledge of what it is that you do, just to know as much as you can about it. And while I think passion alone is probably the single most important, or one of the most important aspects of this art or the work that you do, at the same time, having knowledge, having practical skills that you're able to refine and hone over time is very important. And even if you've got one microphone, knowing every possible thing that you can do with that microphone, where you can put it, what your room is like, what the issues with the room are, what the issues with your equipment are, and knowing other pieces of equipment that you might want at some point to incorporate into that whole process, to just become as good and as able as you possibly can, so that your talent can shine through the technology and through the art that you're making.
Yeah, and I would also remind listeners that the way that you arrive at this understanding of all these different aspects of one microphone in a place is practice, practice, practice. Record a lot and record with the microphone in many different locations and keep trying new stuff.
There's no substitute for woodshedding. It's even if you're woodshedding with a microphone and a mic preamp, there has to be a sensitivity to it. Like, to me, if you want to work at that level, you have to look at every piece of equipment used, every single tool, no matter how humble it might be, as an extension of yourself and your consciousness. You're thinking and feeling through these things, and you're using them, to express yourself and to express the consciousness of other people. That gives you a certain degree of responsibility.
Something I want to point out, you brought up a great term, woodshedding, and it reminds me that your background is the jazz scene in New York. And that's where my brother is. He went from Minneapolis to New York. He's been playing jazz for years there. And that term first came to me through him. And my understanding of woodshedding is literally you take your saxophone out to the woodshed and you lock yourself in there for a long time. Is that a true derivation of that expression?
I'm going to have to defer to your brother on that. I can't say for sure, but it sounds right.
Okay, cool. Well, all right. So let me pick up on another quote from you. You talk about sort of brainstorming ideas when you're producing. And I think anybody who's recording, even if they're recording their own stuff, is always looking for ways to capture the best ideas. One of your quotes here is, often ideas and parts bubble up from my unconscious while I'm listening to something else I'm currently working on. Any idea may pop into my head when I'm doing something completely mundane and meditative, like washing dishes or driving.
Yeah.
Can you comment a little bit on why you think that's important, or more on this idea of the unconscious?
Well, as far as I can tell, the overall idea of I have a record to make is something that kind of is probably dealt with mainly in your left brain, or, where you're dealing with logistics. But a lot of the creative solutions that you might come up with actually emanate from your unconscious. I find that a lot of times I don't even know where stuff is coming from half the time, when something hits me. And, that being the case, I've just found it so important to leave that part of yourself as wide open as you can get it, and just allow for all kinds of possibilities to take place, because you don't know what's in there, which means that you don't know what's going to come out. And it's actually really exciting. It really kind of, it works with whatever knowledge base you have, which of course goes back to the woodshedding comments, but it extrapolates on them so much that it's almost like an alien consciousness, that just shoots you ideas, and you can apply them through whatever technical knowledge you have.
Yeah. And then there's another quote that I think kind of follows that. In this one, I think you're talking about the artist determining why and they're writing particular songs or what they're trying to say and to whom they're trying to say it. But I think it also applies to the producer interacting with the artist. For example, if you come up with your ideas at home, you have these ideas, how do you deliver your ideas effectively to the artist. And the quote is, you can't know what people really want. You definitely can't know what they like, even if they've told you exactly what that is. It's a waste of time. The only thing that matters is what you like. So the question is, what do you like? This is a great quote. And, I've thought about that for myself just in life. It's like the hardest part is not choosing this path or the other. The hardest part is just to know what it is that you want or what you like. And can you comment a little bit about that, about as a producer, maybe as an artist and a songwriter trying to figure out what to create for your listener, or as a producer trying to figure out how to contribute your best creativity to the artist to help them make a great record?
Yeah, sure. By the way, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the converse of that is also equally important, what you don't like. Look, it's real easy to get swayed by other people's points of view and opinions about stuff. And, a lot of times other people are right and you're not. It's important to be able to know, though, when you're allowing your own point of view to get swayed by someone else and when to take a step back and to trust in your own sensibility. And the only way to know that is to be able to sense, again, what it is that you really, really feel strongly about, and that pertains, as you said before, to all other aspects of life, as well as in music and in performing and in record production. My value, I feel, as a record producer is only as useful as much as I'm able to express my own perspective and to share that with someone else with whom I'm working. I feel like I have to be very, very clear about what it is I'm thinking. A lot of times when I listen to a piece of work that someone else has written, I get a really strong sense of what's working and what's not working and where it's happening and where it's not happening. And, what do you do to fix that? Or you just kind of sit there for a little while and rack your brains going like, I wonder why that's not working. Although, in a lot of cases, it's really simple orchestration and arrangement stuff that can be corrected very easily. Bringing that to an artist, then once you've got a solution or more than multiple solutions, is relatively simple. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, actually, that reminds me of a quote that came up recently on I'm like Mr. Quote today, sorry. But it reminds me of a quote on a recent podcast interview with Graham Cochran where he was quoting Ira Glass, and I'll just paraphrase it. But Ira's quote was along the lines of, the first thing we develop is our sense of taste, what we think about music. And then it takes a long time and a great deal of body of work to finally develop the ability to begin to match your sense of taste, what you really like about music with your ability to create it. He's talking about other things than music as well. But I think that pertains to what you're talking about, Michael, where you have to become self-aware enough to trust your inner sense of taste as you're listening to things. You're listening to an artist's work and you're getting a gut sense that something doesn't feel right here and there. And, in your case, of course, you got years and years of experience with how to solve those. But I wonder, how would you reply to that for somebody who's new to this and doesn't quite know how to solve it yet? Should they still trust their inner sense of taste and their gut feeling about the song?
Yep, absolutely. The difference then is that they have to gain the experience. And part of that is going to come from gaining a strong knowledge base, finding as many opportunities as possible to be able to put their intuition to the test, being able to address people's work. One of the best things, as a matter of fact, is to find oneself in a situation where they have to assess someone's work, especially if they don't have a lot of experience doing that, because ultimately you're going to come up against an arrangement issue or something in the orchestration that's difficult and you won't know what the heck's going on. All you'll know is that something's wrong and you'll sit there. It's like, you know what a koan is in Zen?
I don't, but please enlighten us.
It's I'm not the Zen master.
Sorry. No, I didn't mean that facetiously.
No, and I know you didn't. I was just joking. I'm attempting to say I'm not exactly an expert, but I believe it's like an aphorism or like a saying or a quote or something like that you're instructed by your master to sit and think about and, come up with an answer for or explain it to them. And oftentimes to like someone who's thinking logically, it's impossible to answer. Like,
right, like a riddle.
A quan would be, what is the sound of one hand clapping?
Right.
Which, and you're supposed to sit and meditate on this for like hours, sometimes days and weeks. And people, it puts your brain into a pretzel shape. But what I'm saying is that something similar is going to happen when you don't have the kind of experience orchestrating songs. And this is exactly the experience you need in order to get to a point where you kind of have a eureka moment and go, oh my gosh, that's what the problem is, and this is what it needs.
So a couple of things. One is, I was going to ask you, what's the sound of a record that's on the shelf that never gets listened to? Experience that. Or what's the sound of one of those overdubs that you kept that didn't make it to the final cut? Oh goodness, what was I going to say? I had a thought for that. So I can get my thought back.
No, your koan stopped you cold.
It did, really. It just totally put my brain into a pretzel.
There you go.
I know what I was going to say. So again, I'm going to borrow your terminology. The converse is always true, which is that as a producer, sometimes you're in the studio and you do know a lot about how to do things and how to put a record together, but you may be working with an artist that doesn't particularly know how to solve a thing in that moment, but they come to you and tell you that their gut's telling them that something's not right about the way this record's going. And I think it's key to trust that gut feeling of the artist and really believe in that and follow it as well.
Oh man, not only that, you have to, it's important to respect that. And it's also important to encourage it, to kind of share that awareness, to let the artist know that their sensitivity is, it's part of what brings the project to be created and, to fruition in the first place. At the end of a recording project, you can't be the only person who walks out of it having gained something. Like they're in there for an education too, whether they realize it or not. And you, as a producer, want to make sure that everyone walks away with with something of value, not just a finished recording.
Absolutely. You're not supposed to be in there telling them that you think this song sounds like a beach house in Malibu.
Yeah, that's not going to help anybody.
Okay, so I'm going to share another quote of yours, which I think is pertinent to what you just brought up. I really love this one. You said, in order to prove to the artist that you deserve his trust and confidence, you must show him results. In my experience, it often takes 3 demonstrations of your ability as a producer to do this. These demonstrations can be in the form of a musical or arrangement solution you provide for the artist's music, a behavioral aspect of the artist that you address that is properly identified and soothed or eased, or a solution you provide to a physical problem that is affecting the artist's performance. This shows the artist that you're able to contribute creatively and actively in the process. I think that's great. I mean, when I read that, I thought of so many times that all 3 of those things have happened in the studio, and it's always been a positive. It could be working on an arrangement of the song. That first part is like you said, trusting your gut when there's something about those extra 2 bars after the chorus that just feel empty and doesn't go somewhere, or a bridge that just seems meaningless to you, or you don't get it. And then the behavioral aspect would be, that maybe falls into the psychological stuff, and that could be a wide variety of examples. But it might just be pointing out to somebody that you can tell they're not focused and not really paying attention when they're recording, or they're recording as if they were just kind of going through the motion. Yeah. And then the last one is one that I think anybody who's engineering a lot can really jump in on. So the physical problems, I can't tell you how many times pointing out the simplest thing, the hi-hat's slightly too far away and it's causing the timing to be wrong, or there's something about the fact that guitar doesn't play well that isn't going to allow you to play this part cleanly. Mm-hmm. How many times have you taken a piece of tape and just taped up all the unused strings on an electric guitar?
It's happened.
So that's great advice, and I think anybody can take that away.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Michael, I have some questions from listeners and readers that I'd like to share with you. Can I ask some of those?
Oh, absolutely.
There's not too many here, but there's a few.
It's okay.
We'll see how they go. So this one comes from Matthew Wise, if I'm pronouncing your last name right, Matthew. And he says that I read that Michael gave Chris Cornell some Frank Sinatra to listen to before tracking Black Hole Sun. Were there any other artists he recommended to the band to help shape the sound of Superunknown?
No.
But you did reference Frank Sinatra in your book too, which I thought was great. You could talk about that concept for a minute. You talked about sort of creating cognitive dissonance. Was that the chapter? Showing different styles of music and drawing inspiration? Well,
I guess there's a little of that in there, but I was trying to draw a parallel because, Chris it's hard to argue that he's one of the greatest rock vocalists ever. I also felt that there was always a little something emotionally that he was kind of withholding a bit, that kind of went with his personality, and I wanted to kind of draw it out some on that record. I thought that would be a very important component in making that record. And it's funny because I came across a description of Sinatra. I was looking for him on iTunes for something else recently, and he was referred to as probably the single most important performer, popular music performer of the 20th century. And I was like, okay. And that's because, to a great extent, even if you don't like the kind of music that he does or any of his songs, he really is that. He perfected a means of being able to express himself. I mean, he was a consummate technician, but he was able to express himself perfectly. Like it was the perfect kind of juncture of technique and expression going on. I mean, when you listen to one of his vocals and you really dig into what he's doing phrasing-wise, how he's using his breath, how he's articulating and using the tone in his voice, it's pure perfection. You can hear his brain working, like making these computations, but at the same time, it's also completely unconscious. Like he's just doing this thing. And I also read somewhere that he said, no matter what I've done in my life, when I sing a song, I become that piece of music.
That's great.
And you can feel it. He becomes this piece of music. Though I'm not crazy about his up-tempo ballads. Like to me, the sad stuff that he's done, the moody stuff, it really reflects all of his technique. Like he doesn't get to coast as much on this. Because he's got a, if you read about the guy, you see he had a lot of horrible things happen to him in his life. And he's really he's showing that through his performance, and he's not holding anything back. And I wanted to share that with Chris. And I have played those things for other people to really kind of demonstrate what it means for someone who's really emoting.
Yeah.
When you listen to a song like Only the Lonely, for example, take the arrangement out of it and just listen to his vocal performance. It's unbelievable.
Now, Michael, you've worked with a lot of artists that maybe have a lot of emotional struggle from which to draw and create brilliant records. Is there any hope for the rest of us who may have just grown up and everything's cool? I mean, does everybody have that in them that they can find something truly expressive and emotional to share with the world?
That's a very subjective question, actually. Well, I don't think that being completely tormented is is the secret or goal to being an artist.
Okay.
It's there are people who are perfectly happy and have found satisfaction and deep personal satisfaction in their lives. They're terrific artists.
Yeah.
I think I may have also touched on this in the book, but being an artist is really kind of like being a conduit, for information from someplace else, to kind of let it pass through you. I mean, who knows what that is? Who knows where it comes from? Once again, like the song structure, the suffering that a person does in their life is really just part of the mechanism. It's, it creates a unique experience that gets shared, but ultimately we're all so unique. Who who's to say who will and who won't be a great artist until they actually try to do it.
Yeah, sure. Well, so there was something you said in there about the way that Frank would be the song that I thought was cool. So you have another quote of yours where you said, where music is concerned, the now is all that matters. Now is when you're hearing it. Now is when you find it exciting. Now is when you are tired of it.
Yeah.
And it's so true. The music is the moment.
Yeah.
It's just the moment.
It really is. And that's another reason why it's good to have a vision that's as distilled as possible, because if there are events that take place inside of that are slack, that don't deliver, and I'm not talking about dynamically, because, you know, there are obviously points in time where things need to get soft and they need to speed up a little bit, et cetera. Mm-hmm. You know, if there's a slack event that happens in this thing, it can really detract from the overall, you know, and really kind of wipe out all the expectation that you had building up to the point where something went wrong.
Yep. You talked about that in the book. You said that sometimes those moments happen and they can even kill your revisiting excitement of that first part of the song that you thought you loved a moment ago.
Totally.
So let's see. Let me go to another question. This one comes from John Tidy, who wants to hear about Marilyn Manson sessions. That was his question. We already talked some about that. I remembered something that I had read too about cutting the bass on Mechanical Animals. It was something along the lines of that the bass was turned up so loud that it was physically compressing the bass sound just in the room. Yeah.
When I've had the opportunity to record that way, I sort of favor it. It's fun. I'm not quite sure what the physical aspect of what's going on is, but it changes everything. And what's even more fun is to stick all your amplification into a really small area that can't handle it.
Like guitar amps and bass amp, just all the amps on the song?
Well, not playing at the same time, but certainly with bass, where you're dealing with so much low end. Actually, when we did bass on that, and when I did bass with Korn, we kind of did the same thing. We crammed all the amplification plus subwoofers.
Wow.
We had I don't remember how many, because I like to record drums with subwoofers as well. We had 12,000 watts. So it's it was 6 dual 18 cabs with the crossover set to at 80 hertz or something like that. You know, whatever sounded best in the room, and a lot of wattage. And we jammed all the same amplification, or as much as we could get inside of this closet.
Wow.
Yeah. We destroyed lighting fixtures.
Yeah, I've noticed that when you start turning the bass cabinets up, all of a sudden everything in the studio is broken. Everything's vibrating. You can't ever get it to be quiet in there. You can't get the snares far enough away.
Yeah. Well, this wasn't being cut live, so it wasn't an issue for the rest of the instruments.
Yeah. So here's something that I also remembered about. I don't know if it was those sessions, but I'm imagining that if it's that loud, you're probably running a line out to the amps, to the speakers, and maybe you're listening in the control room. And I had heard something about you developing a guitar isolation switcher box that had, could send it out to a number of different guitar amps. And not only that, but you had taken 1,000 transformers or something and measured each one until you found the exact right ones that didn't change the guitar sound one bit. Was that right? Was that you, or was that somebody else?
I had nothing to do with that. I know that I went through a lot of switcher boxes because I think that may have been my story. I just kept going through them because I found that they all they loaded the amps completely. Incorrect is relative, I suppose, but there's always a difference between what it sounds like when you plug directly into the amplifier and what it sounds like when you're splitting to a bunch of different amplifiers from a single source. And a lot of splitting devices just simply aren't capable of giving you an accurate representation. And my thing is always if I like the way it sounds going into the one amp, I want it to sound like that, being derived from from a multiple source.
Yeah.
And I found a switcher box that did that. Unfortunately, there aren't very many of them.
Okay, you don't have to tell us until you're ready to sell them off on eBay, and then you can let the world know.
No. It was made by a guy named Kirk something or other who was in Vancouver, and he subsequently made more, but he had used a particular component that he couldn't get any more of in the original 6 switcher boxes. A guy out here named Brett Allen actually has 2 of them, and it's not easy. It's not easy to find devices that will give you an accurate representation of it.
I think I remember Brett. He guitar teched for us, I believe. Am I thinking of the right guy? Yeah, he was a super nice guy. He always showed up in sandals.
Yeah, that's him.
Real nice guy. Let's see, what else did I want to ask you about? So here's another question. This one comes from Ian Shepard, who's a mastering engineer, and his is related to mastering. He wondered what your thoughts were, because I guess Soundgarden Superunknown had maybe recently been remastered. I don't remember if he said it was 2013, but with the changes in levels and things getting louder and that sort of thing, do you have any comments on the experience of a record as you made it, when you made it versus when it was re-released and mastered more recently?
I have to plead ignorance here because I actually haven't heard it remastered. I don't know what it sounds like, so it's hard for me to say. I'm just going to hope it sounds really good.
Okay, cool. Well, what about just overall, just your perspective on how loud records have gotten more recently? Has that been something that has been fine with you, bothered you, doesn't seem to matter as long as the performance is right on?
You know what? If people want to make records louder, it's none of my business. I think, when someone has mixed a record to sound a certain way and it goes to mastering, and then all of a sudden, like the default position a mastering engineer goes into is to crank it and to, adjust for peaks by adding massive amounts of compression. That's a whole different story. I've had to deal with that over the past 10, 15 years, where people just apply a compressor immediately to it so that they can jack the overall gain up and squelch peaks. And unfortunately, when you've tried to make something to have a certain tonal response to it, when you affect the peaks that way, obviously it's going to change the overall sound of your recording as well. If that's acceptable to someone else, that's their business. To me, it's never really worked. So I don't enjoy that.
So have you always found that it's been best for you to have a real back and forth dialogue with your mastering engineer?
I would prefer to, yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right, great. Wonderful. Thank you for answering that. So
Sure.
here's the last one, Michael. This one comes from Bjorgvin Benediktsson, our mutual friend.
Oh, yeah.
And he says, I would like to know if he had any interesting cultural differences when working with Mew. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yes.
And if he approached the session in any way differently when working with the Danes. So they're Danish, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Great.
Well, I'd already done a record with them, so any cultural differences had been pretty much addressed and dealt with prior to making this one. I did notice that their senses of humor, or what they found funny, could be considerably different than mine. I actually was into watching, that movie Friday?
Oh, yeah.
So I went through a period of time where I really enjoyed that a lot, and Next Friday.
Right.
And, so I was like, oh man, these guys they're from out of town. They're from Denmark. They're going to think this is really funny, and, so I kind of pumped them up. I was like, oh my God, you're going to be splitting your sides watching this. And, I asked them like a couple of weeks later, and they just blanked me, and they were kind of like, what was that? Like, one of them said, that wasn't funny at all. Obviously, the cultural aspect of it were completely out of their reference.
I imagine that happens too sometimes when you're just trying to suggest music to bands. You even talked about that in your book. Well, this was slightly different, but being very careful about not referencing other projects that you might be working on with the band. And I guess that's a little different, but it's still the idea of sometimes you have to be very careful about what influences you're trying to mix in there
Well, yeah. Also, like, not telling them about other stuff you're doing is kind of courteous.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly.
It might bring up a little bit of competition, because I've seen that happen, and people always get a little bit kind of like, what? You're working on something else?
So you were never one of those producers that's got 5 sessions going on in town and you're just dropping in for an hour at each one or anything like that?
That's not really.
Not your style?
No. Nothing against anyone who does that, but not me.
I hope you're enjoying this interview with Michael Beinhorn. We're just about to go into the jam session, but before we do, I wanted to remind you to check out his new book, Unlocking Creativity, A Producer's Guide to Making Music and Art. And you can find the link to that directly in the show notes at the end of this episode. Just go straight to rsrockstars.com/9, and I'll have all the links to the stuff we're talking about and a link straight to the book on Amazon so you can pick up a copy or one for your Kindle, however you like to read it. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the episode. Here's the jam session. Cheers. This is what I like to call the jam session, where I just ask you a series of, they're meant to be pretty quick questions. They may be kind of lackluster compared to the amazing stuff you've already shared. But if you're ready, I'll jump right into it.
Yeah, man.
Okay, cool. So tell us something that was holding you back at the beginning.
At the beginning of what? You mean when I got started?
Sure, when you got started, or somewhere along the way where it was something really important that you wanted to do. I mean, even more recently, I know you started publishing your blog and publishing your book, and you must have had something maybe that was holding you back from that initially.
Well, yeah, self-esteem mainly, insecurity. That was one reason why I read that quote at the beginning of this podcast, about not sharing your brilliance with the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Which is not by way of me saying I'm brilliant, but it is a way of saying that everyone else, if they have a spark of anything inside of themselves, needs to be unafraid of sharing it and just go out there and do it in one way or another. Because it's been put in you for a reason. I was very, very insecure when I went out on my own. It caused me to languish for a little while. That definitely held me back a lot.
When you say going out on your own, do you mean your first time in New York, or do you mean later when you left the record label?
When I stopped working with Material, because I've been part of our production team, and everything just came to us as a group. Like, I had to go out on my own to seek work. And it was really difficult for me because I really doubted myself.
I think that's very encouraging, because clearly it worked.
Yeah.
So, yeah, for anybody who's listening to this, if you're struggling with those first moves, know that it's totally okay to go screw up.
Oh, man, as often as possible.
Yeah. Well, so, Michael, this next one, again, we may have covered this already, but can you share some of the best advice that you received about recording and making records? Maybe something early on when you were in New York.
It's funny that you asked this, because I was talking about it yesterday with someone else, and I actually did write a blog piece about it as well. When I was a little kid and starting out with Material, I was like a little street punk, basically, and into synthesizers and things like that. And I was learning how to work like a Buchla 200 system at I think it was a 200 at this place downtown. And in Material, we were working with this guy, a jazz drummer by the name of Stu Martin, who not many people would know of, but his CV was like, about as long as your forearm. Like, he played with Duke Ellington and Count Basie, and he was definitely a real character. And, he actually had these 2 EMS Synthie AKSs that he would jam with. Like, he just set up sequence. I don't know if you're familiar with
those
them.
the suitcase looking?
Yep, and they've got these digital sequencers in them, and he'd just do these random patterns, and he'd somehow find time with them, which is crazy because there's no quantizing in them at all. And, so he'd do this, and I knew, and he loaned them to me. I knew he was into it. So at one point, I just, I was kind of like, asking him if he wanted to, like, try these Buchlas. I guess I was acting, felt like I was doing him a favor, trying to get in with him.
You're trying to upgrade him.
And this is how old school this guy was. He put me up against a wall and he lectured me for like almost 2 hours in my face. And I was, I was like 20 or something like that. I was like pissing my pants. And this guy was up in my face, and he just kept saying this one thing over and over again. He was like, you got to give. That's all. I mean, that was like the crux of everything that he was saying.
Wow.
it was one of the most surreal things that ever happened to me, but it never left. Like, it always stayed with me. I mean, that was definitely a message from someplace else.
That is intense.
Yeah, it was very intense.
I was afraid when we started this interview that you would, take me by the scruff of my neck and up against the wall. Well, all right. So next up, again, we may have covered some of these, but how about a recording tip, hack, or secret sauce? Here we go, getting real techie. How about something home recording related for people who are, starting out with their studio and they don't have a lot of gear?
Well, I mean, to me, that's really just about using your ears and listening to the acoustic environment that you're working in, trying to find out the best ways to optimize your space.
Do you ever do that thing where you would go out and you listen to the instrument with your ear and then put the microphone, position microphones based on what you're hearing in the room?
I've done that, yeah. I mean, I guess, is that kind of like a tip?
Sure. I think anything's good. I mean, your tip could be there are no secret sauces or hacks. You just got to get started. I don't know. There are lots of little things that I'll do. Like, I discovered that someone actually showed me this, that in some cases, getting sheets of thick plywood, like two big sheets of thick 4x8s or something like that, mm-hmm. and screwing them together, and then sort of like drilling the bass drum through the pedal into the plywood, and then kind of butting the bass drum up against like a 2x4, and having that also be connected actually helps amplify the drum kit in a really nice way. Really? So let me see if I can say this back to you. So the kick drum pedal itself, and then the kick drum is all sitting on a plywood panel, and there's a 2x4 that the other end of the kick drum is backing up against, so they can't slide away when you're kicking it or hitting it?
We'd use like 2 sheets of of birch, really good, like 3/4 inch plywood, 4x8, and then and then drilling them at both ends so that they connect with 2x4s, and using a 2x4 then after you've drilled the bass drum pedal into the right spot on the wood where you like it to sit in the room, to use another 2x4, which obviously you drill into the wood as well, into the plywood base, to anchor the bass drum, so the drummer can hit it as hard as possible and the bass drum won't move, and it uses the wooden base, the plywood base, as an amplifier.
So it's kind of resonant. There's airspace underneath the plywood.
Well, in a lot of cases, you'll actually want to fuse the bass drum, like have the bass drum touching the plywood, so the plywood acts as an amplifier. It tends to make the drum kit a lot louder.
Yeah.
Sometimes, depending on what the space is underneath the floor, it can add unwanted resonance, but for the most part, it can be really, really effective.
Well, I may have to see if I can get you to email me a little, sketch on a napkin or something, and I'll include that with the show notes for listeners.
Sure.
All right. So how about a favorite hardware tool, something physical that you really like to have with you when you're making a record?
Oh, God.
Anything at all.
Oh, my God. There's so many of them. I'm trying to make myself less hardware dependent at this point.
What's the one that you just simply wouldn't do without?
Oh, wow. I mean, I love old Neve Germanium stuff. I mean, I love 251, like the Telefunken 251 for vocals. That's kind of high-endy stuff. I really love processing instruments through synthesizers. There's just so much. There's just so many things. Honestly, it really depends on the project I'm working on.
Yeah.
These days, a little bit more with the synths and like some stomp boxes and things like that. But it depends on where I'm recording, how much gear there actually is to start with.
Are there any things like tuners or metronomes that people tend to rely on computers for, and you've found that bringing one in physically is far better?
It depends. Some drummers play well to a click. Some drummers actually play better to a loop. Yeah, I mean, it varies. I've worked with drummers, although none recently, who absolutely detested using a click and were actually so good that they could start out with a click and, count off, shut the click off when they're counting off, and you finish a take, then you go back into the studio and listen. And this one guy was actually such a show off. He would say, watch this. He'd turn the click on at any point in the song and it would be locked in rock solid. And he hadn't played with the click.
That's great.
Yeah, I never saw anything like it.
That's great. Well, click and drum tempo is a funny thing because I think so many people get the message these days that something about what the computer says about your music is right, and you're supposed to be as good as the computer. And I just don't think that's true. I mean, maybe you can comment a little bit about why drums sometimes need to be not on a click.
Well, I mean, it really depends on what kind of music you're making. Like with some music, it's appropriate to have things that lock up, and that's fine and good, but I think that people respond very much to something that's a little bit more free and a little bit more loose and a little bit more human. There's a reason why there's more of a sexy groove to an AC/DC record or a Led Zeppelin record or something, even though AC/DC is just going boom, da, boom, da, But the thing is that where the drummer places his hits determines completely how this music is going to feel, and also to a great extent, it lets you know this is AC/DC. It also lets you know that these drums were not quantized; they weren't edited. You're not hearing anything like that when you listen to Back in Black or something.
You mentioned drum hits and where they're placed. You had made some comments about why the drums and the kick drum, for example, was important, relevant to the vocal.
Well, the bass drum is really anchoring the music. And if in a lot of cases where you have a push from a bass drum is going to always emphasize where a vocal lands. If the vocal and the kick drum are landing in the same spot, obviously that bass drum is going to emphasize the vocal phrase. If the bass drum lands in a place other than a vocal phrase, you have to make sure, you have to be conscious that it's the right place. Otherwise you run the risk of taking focus off the vocal or emphasizing a wrong part of the vocal, which also, by the way, takes emphasis off the vocal, affecting the perceived tempo of a song, the perceived feel of a song, causing it to slow down. There can be all sorts of problems. So like that relationship, and also with the bass guitar, those three instruments together are really, really important relative to vocal placement and vocal phrases.
Do you find that it's common on a record that you have to enlighten the drummer as to where those vocal phrases are landing? Or have you discovered that sometimes if you just make sure he hears lots of vocal in his headphones, that's a great way to do pre-production and rehearsal? Sometimes the drummer has already figured it out and there isn't really anything that needs to be added. In other cases, they get fired.
I don't think anyone would get removed for something like that. That happens more when they can't actually perform the parts.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, on that recording, there was an immense amount of work done to orchestrate the drums so that they worked well with the vocals. In fact, that was about a month and a half worth of pre-production spent rewriting a lot of the drummer's parts. And that was the extent that was needed to be able to get the drums to work properly, pushing the song along, maintaining the feel, and also having the vocals having the drums act properly as supportive information to the vocal.
Yeah, I find I spend a lot of time working with bands that way, where we're just really focused on the way the drums are sitting against the vocal and the guitar strum too.
Yeah.
Sometimes the rhythm guitar has got all the information you need.
Oh my gosh, it's so important. And you have to pick the right strum in order to work with all the rhythm instruments once you've got them sorted out.
I had just sent an email out talking about this story that I heard about Charlie Watts of the Rolling Stones, that he only has, if you listen to his drum monitor, it's just got Keith Richards' guitar in it, and that's it.
That's funny.
Just great. It makes sense to me. I could see how that would be a thing.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it's exaggerated at the same time. I like all good stories. So how about a favorite software tool, something that you really like using in the computer?
I am not an expert when it comes to those types of things. As far as a recorder, if I had my choice, I would go for a DSD system. The only one I've used is the Sonoma. It doesn't sound like anything else that anyone has ever put on God's earth to record stuff. It's just absolutely remarkable. But for more real world stuff, where we're usually using Pro Tools or Nuendo, there are a lot of wonderful plugins. I enjoy Reason very much. Being that I like synthesizers so much, and
you get to see the wires.
That's also fun, But there are a lot of really, really terrific software pieces that you can get. I don't favor anyone. It's interesting. This guy I've been working with actually showed me recently this Blackface 1176 plugin, which is like, apparently it's not like a UA. It's not one of the other more expensive ones. It's like a $49 plugin, and it really sounds good. I was surprised, and he said, this is my go-to 1176.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I don't remember the name of the manufacturer.
Let's see if I can get you to send that over with your plywood drum riser sketch later on.
Okay.
And I'll put that in the show notes for everybody. All right. Okay. So, Michael, I've got a few more. I'll try and make them really quick. I thank you so much, and especially since we've gone way over time for what I said we would be doing.
My pleasure.
So I thank you so much for that. So how about a resource for the business side of making records? Clearly, you've been doing that for many years. What advice do you have for anybody who's getting started now and wants to make sure they're doing it right?
Cover your ass.
Okay, all right.
Be very clear about what you're doing. If you do favors for anyone, make sure that it's recognized, and make sure that you know exactly what you're getting into and that you're doing something that you will be able to live with. I have gone down that road many, many times. Quite a few times I've actually regretted it, which is not to say you shouldn't, but it's important to really, really look at what the situation is that you're getting yourself into beforehand. It's important to know what a producer contract looks and reads like, and to know what your rights are. You don't want to be, you don't want to be taken advantage of by people, and recognize that this is a much different business than it was certainly when I got started. And people, it's interesting. I've discovered that people are a bit less professional now than they used to be. There are more situations where people will kind of reach out to do a project, and then you won't hear from them. And I know, and I've spoken to a lot of other people. The same thing happens to them. People, a lot of people who are artists or in management or whatever don't take the process as seriously as you might, but that shouldn't be something that deters a person from wanting to do their job and to be as professional as possible. And that's really, really important.
Yeah. Is there a place where somebody who doesn't know what a producer contract looks like might begin looking?
I can't really answer that question with certainty. I would imagine that there are resources online. I think the Business of Music books probably have some kind of indication of what that looks like.
Okay, great. All right. So, Michael, this is a hypothetical question, but if you were dropped in a strange city, you were kind of starting over and you had to take a simple setup for recording music, you wanted to find people to record, and you wanted to make ends meet while you started out your career doing this, what would you do?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I suppose I would probably be going to a lot of shows and seeing people perform and trying to make inroads in any community where there are a lot of musicians rehearsing, just get my name around. I would imagine that there are message boards and online communities where you can access people who want or need a recording done. Just be prepared to essentially work very hard for very little appreciation or compensation or anything like that.
That's very true. I think that just taking on whatever you can get, any job that will leave you some flexibility so that when a session opportunity comes along, you're ready for it.
Well, if you're starting out, you don't have too many opportunities and you don't have too many choices either. If you're charming enough and you know how to talk to people, you've certainly got a good in, but you have to be able to back it up with something really, really special. And what's interesting is that if you do have talent and you're willing to work very hard for it, eventually stuff starts to happen. You just can't let anything deter you whatsoever. And I'm speaking now as someone who actually has let things deter them. So I know what I'm talking about.
That's great advice.
Yeah, you just have to push. You have to be ready to push as hard as you possibly can.
You only get one go around with all this, so you might as well.
Yes. Or here's another quote. You only get one shot. It's best if you don't take it when you're aiming at your feet.
That's great.
Yes.
I love it. Yet another tweet. Okay, so Michael, you've probably answered this over and over again in this interview, but what would you say is the single most important thing that somebody can do to become a rock star of the recording studio?
Be great.
There you go. Be great.
That's it. Well, you have to know, and this goes back to what I said before about talent, about what talent really is in a situation like this. It really pertains mainly to being the most patient, the most intent-driven, and I'll say it again, talent is often nothing other than being far more dedicated, focused, patient, and intent-driven than anyone else who does the same job as you.
I think that's great. That's a really wonderful quote. And a reminder that the focus and the intent that you're driven towards, you don't know the right answer when you start, but you do have to pick one and go for it.
You have to pick one, you have to go for it, and you have to prove to not only the people you're working with, but to yourself that you're willing to go all the way with whatever it is that you do, not to slack, not to drop off, not to say, this is too much. It's all about proving yourself and showing that you really, really have what it takes.
That's so awesome. And on that fantastic advice, let's bring our listeners back to one more reintroduction from you of your new book, this wonderful resource to help give people the tools that they need if they want to produce records. Can you tell us about your book and let our listeners know how can they find you and how can they follow you, Michael?
Well, my book is called Unlocking Creativity. It's published by Hal Leonard, and it speaks to a lot of things, but I wanted to go into record production from a non-technical point of view because no one's ever done that before. And I feel that the intrinsic aspects of the process are being kind of forgotten, and that people are kind of focusing more on, how do you get this great guitar sound? How do you do this? How do you do that? And people are not really talking as much about why. Why am I doing something? And also addressing record production, not just as a utility, but as a means for an artist, because that's what we are, to personally express ourselves. Mm-hmm. I felt that writing a book was a really good way to open a dialogue up about this in the music and the recording community. And it's interesting because a lot of people who are in arts outside of the recording arts and music have been reading it, and I've gotten a lot of really, really wonderful feedback from them about it as well. So I'm very happy about it.
I thought about that a lot when I was reading the book, about how much this pertains to the artistic community for, sculptural art, painting, abstract art, any of it.
It's all connected, and I do have a website, obviously, michaelbeinhorn.com. I'm on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram.
Right on. Well, Michael Beinhorn, thank you so much for joining us on Recording Studio Rockstars. I and our listeners are truly humbled and honored for you to be here and give us so much of your time. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, man. It was a pleasure.
All right. Cheers.
All right.
Talk to you soon.
To you. Take care. Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.